There's a type of misalignment that doesn't announce itself, doesn't show up as crisis, it doesn't trigger an alarm, it just sits there, unresolved. If alignment requires perfect condition, then it's truly not a standard, it's a wish. And here's the thing about waiting for ideal conditions. They don't show up. What actually happens is you get better at functioning with the gap. What have you been calling temporary that has quietly become normal? Not in theory, in practice. Why do you tolerate personally what you would never allow professionally? Your professional career, your professional success is giving you permission to tolerate personal misalignment. Because as long as your resume looks good, you can always tell yourself everything's fine.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
There's a type of misalignment that doesn't announce itself, doesn't show up as crisis, it doesn't trigger an alarm, it just sits there, unresolved, while everything else keeps moving forward. Your career progresses, your reputation holds, your income grows, and yet, if you're honest, there's a gap between what your resume says about you and what your life actually reflects. Now, that's not failure, it's not collapse. It's just a quiet distance between the two that you've learned to navigate around. This episode is about that gap and why capable men tolerate it far longer than they ever should. And so today's episode is titled Your Resume Looks Better Than Your Life. And it's not about your achievements, it's not about your success, and it's not about comparing your life to someone else's highlight reel. Today's episode is about a specific pattern that shows up in high-performing men who apply professional discipline everywhere except where it matters most. And if that lands uncomfortably, then do stay with me, because recognition is that first step, and it's the step that most men skip. So let's start with something that you might recognize. There's nothing on fire, is there? Bills are paid, responsibilities are covered, and people depend on you, and you show up. From the outside, your life functions, but internally, there's this low-grade unease. It's not panic, it's not desperation, it's just this persistent sense that something's totally off. And here's what's interesting. When that feeling surfaces, most men do one of two things. They're either going to explain it away, I'm just tired, or this is a busy season, or they outrun it entirely by staying busy enough that the question never fully forms. But the unease doesn't leave, it just becomes background noise, doesn't it? So let's slow that down just for a second and think about the last time you had an uninterrupted weekend. Not a weekend where you caught up on work, and not a weekend where you finally handled some home projects. But how about an actual weekend where you were present relationally, mentally, and emotionally? How long ago was that? And when was the last time you had a real conversation with your spouse that wasn't logistical? It wasn't about schedules, not about the kids, not about what needs to happen next week. It's just a conversation where you actually connected. And if you're struggling to remember, that's the gap that I'm talking about right now. You see, your resume says you're a leader, but leadership at home has quietly become management, hasn't it? And management, if we're willing to be precise, is just controlled distance. You're managing the system, but you're not actually in it. And so here's a question we're sitting with. What are you managing instead of addressing? Because there is a difference. Management keeps things moving, but it doesn't close the gap. And so here's the story that tends to show up next. You've heard it before. It's just a season. Things will settle down after this next project. Once we get through this transition, I'll have more bandwidth. That explanation sounds reasonable It sounds mature, and even for a while, it might hold up. But the problem is it's almost never true, because what you're calling a season has a way of becoming the standard operating pattern in your life. And so let's think about it. How many times have you told yourself, after this, things will ease up? And how many times after this actually arrived? Most men don't realize they're even saying this for years. It's not because they're lying to themselves, but it's because the next thing always shows up before the previous thing gets resolved. It's a new project. It's a new responsibility. It's a new crisis that needs your attention. And so the pattern just continues. And it's not because you're avoiding the issue, but because you've built a life that requires you to keep moving. And here's what I mean by that. Your professional life rewards momentum, doesn't it? It's decisiveness, it's execution, it's getting things done. And so you're trained yourself to move toward the next thing before the current thing is fully resolved. And that works beautifully in business, but it fails at home. Because the most important things in your personal life don't operate on project timelines, do they? Your marriage doesn't have a launch date. Your kids don't have quarterly reviews. Your own integral integrity doesn't have a competing metric. These things require sustained attention, not just episodic effort. And if you're waiting for margin to show up before you address them, you're going to be waiting indefinitely. So here's a question I have for you. What have you been calling temporary that has quietly become normal? Not in theory, in practice. What pattern has been running long enough that it's no longer a season, it's actually become your life? And so let me shift the frame for a second. If this gap existed in your business, you wouldn't tolerate it. If you saw subtle misalignment in your team, people going through the motions, delivering output, but not actually engaged, you'd name it, wouldn't you? You'd address it. You'd bring in outside perspective if you needed to, because you know that small drift left uncorrected becomes structural, and structural problems don't fix themselves, do they? You'd never look at a quarterly report that showed steady decline and say, I'll deal with that next year. You'd never ignore feedback from your board because you were too busy, would you? And you'd never let a key relationship on your team erode simply because you didn't have time to invest in it. That would be professionally negligent, wouldn't it? And yet the same man who runs a tight operation at work will tolerate years of relational drift at home. The same man who demands accountability from his team will go months without a real conversation with his spouse. It's the same man who invests in coaching, consulting, and development for his business will refuse to get mentorship for his personal life. Why is that? It's not because he doesn't care, but because he's applied two completely different standards. Professionally, drift is unacceptable. Personally, drift is understandable. And professionally, gaps get addressed early. Personally, gaps get explained. Professionally, outside perspective is normal. Personally, outside perspective feels like failure. So here's another question for you. Why do you tolerate personally what you would never allow professionally? Now, I'm not asking you to have an answer. I'm asking you to notice the double standard. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And really, that's the point of today's episode. At this point, there are probably a few objections forming in your mind. So let me name the most common ones that I hear. This isn't the right time. Other people have real problems. Mine aren't that bad. I just need to get through these next few months, and then I'll have space to deal with this. As I said, those sound pretty reasonable. But let me test them. If alignment requires perfect condition, then it's truly not a standard, it's a wish. And here's the thing about waiting for ideal conditions. They don't show up. Life doesn't get less complex. Responsibilities doesn't decrease. Margin doesn't magically appear. What actually happens is you get better at functioning with the gap. You get better at managing the distance. You get better at explaining why now just isn't the time. And the gap just doesn't close, does it? It just becomes part of the landscape, your environment. And so let me give you a concrete example. And think about a man who says, I'll focus on my marriage after this work season ends. What he doesn't realize is that his wife has already adjusted. She's not waiting for him to re-engage. She's building a life that functions without his full presence. And she's not doing it out of spite. She's doing it out of necessity. Because people adapt to the systems that they live in. And if the system requires your absence or your partial presence, then people will stop expecting more. That's not resilience. That's resignation. And it happens slowly enough that you don't notice until the gap is structural. So here's the real question. What explanation are you using to stay exactly where you are? Not the explanation you'd give someone else. It's the one you're telling yourself. Because that's the same one that's keeping you stuck. And so here's where it gets particularly interesting. The same achievements that look impressive on your resume can actually mask the misalignment in your life. So let me give you some examples. See, you're the guy people come to for leadership advice at work. You've built teams, you've scaled operations, you've navigated complex organizational challenges. People respect your judgment, they value your input, and they seek your counsel. And yet, at home, you're not leading. You're managing logistics. Or here's another one. You're known professionally for your ability to develop people. You invest in your team. You create growth opportunities. You have a reputation for bringing out the best in others. But your own kids, you're not sure what's actually going on in their lives beyond the surface level updates. You know their schedules and you know their activities. But you don't know what they're struggling with, what they're thinking about, or what they're becoming. Or how about this one? And this one lands hard for a lot of men. You're sought after for your strategic thinking. People pay you to see around corners, to anticipate problems, to plan 3 moves ahead. That's literally what you're known for. And yet, in your life, you're watching patterns develop that you would never tolerate in business. You're calling it, not the right time to address it. The professional paradox is this. The very skills that make you successful professionally are the ones you're not applying personally. It's not because you can't, gentlemen, but because you've created a mental separation between the two domains. Work is where standards are. Home is where you get a pass. Work is where you're elevated. Home is where you're just doing your best. Work is where drift gets corrected. Home is where drift gets explained. But here's what's actually happening. Your professional career, your professional success is giving you permission to tolerate personal misalignment. Because as long as your resume looks good, you can always tell yourself everything's fine. As long as people respect you at work, you can avoid the question of whether people feel connected to you at home. As long as your career is advancing, you can defer the harder question of whether your life is actually aligned. Resume becomes the proof that you're doing well, and it obscures the gap. And so here's the question we're sitting with. What are you known for professional that you're not living personally? Again, not in theory, but in practice. What leadership quality do people see in you at work that's completely absent at home? What standard do you hold others to that you're not holding yourself to? Because if you can see it in business context, you already know how to address it. The question is whether you're willing to apply the same rigor personally that you do professionally. And here's what most men don't realize. This doesn't stay internal. Unresolved tension becomes climate, not conflict, but climate, an emotional temperature of the environment that you're creating. And so people start to adjust to it. Your spouse learns what's safe to bring up and what's not. Your kids learn what gets your attention and what actually doesn't. Your team learns what version to expect. Not because you're intentionally withholding, but because systems adapt to patterns. And the pattern you've created is this. Partial presence is normal. Functional distance is acceptable. And bringing up the gap creates tension that no one wants to navigate. So they stop bringing it up. And you interpret that as everything's fine, but it's not fine. It's just being managed. And there's a big difference. And so here's another question. What is it like to live inside the environment that you're creating? Not what you intended to create, but what you're actually creating. Because intent doesn't determine impact. The pattern does. And so let's bring this all the way home. If your life were evaluated within the same rigor as your career, would it pass? No, don't answer that just yet. Just sit with the question for a moment. Where would it fail first? What are you managing instead of resolving? Who in your life already sees this gap, but isn't naming it? And here's the one that cuts the deepest. If nothing changes, if this pattern continues exactly as it is, what does your life realistically look like in 2 years from now? Not the worst case, not the catastrophe, just the logical extension of the current trajectory. Is it more distance, more management, more functional disconnection? That's not speculation. That's momentum that you're creating. And momentum doesn't reverse on its own. And so what serious men understand is they don't outsource this responsibility, but they also don't rely on self-assessments in complex systems, because self-assessment has blind spots. It always does. You can't see the gap from the inside, from being inside the gap. You can't measure drift when you're the one who's drifting. That's not weakness. That's just how systems work. And professionally, I know you know this already, because you don't run a business without advisors, and you don't train for performance without coaching. You don't navigate high-stakes decisions without outside perspective, because professionals don't confuse independence with isolation. And yet, personally, most men operate alone. They treat mentorship as an admission of failure rather than a mark of seriousness. But here's the reality. The men who close the gap are the ones who place themselves in environments where the gap gets named. Not judged, it's just named. It's where drift gets measured before it becomes damage. Where standards are maintained, not just managed. That's not help, that's calibration. And calibration is how you prevent the slow erosion that most men don't notice until it's structural. And so at this point, clarity isn't the issue. You already know what this is. The unease you've been explaining away. That's recognition trying to surface. It's the gap between your resume and your life. That's the real part. And the question isn't whether you see it. The question is whether you're willing to let it stay unnamed. Because naming it is going to be the first step. And most men stop right there. They see the gap, they acknowledge it privately, and then they go back to managing it. But recognition without response isn't insight. It's just more drift with better vocabulary. Your resume may look impressive. The question is whether your life does. And the band of brothers is where men stop managing the gap and actually start closing it. And if that's where you're at, you know what you can do.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is The Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.